I saw a post on Facebook from a writer who was editing their first draft of their fantasy novel. And they were concerned because the book was 180,000 words. And they've heard the advice. They know that is just too long for a debut novel, even though it's fantasy. And so they were really concerned and they weren't sure how to proceed. They mentioned they might possibly cut the book in half to split it into 2 stories, but they had mentioned that it didn't quite feel right. And I first want to just acknowledge them for saying this. When a writer says that their story is over 100,000 words, the most common advice I see is to just split it in 2. And today I'm going to be talking about why this is good intentioned but bad advice. So I saw a post on Facebook from a writer who just finished their first fantasy novel, which was a huge accomplishment for them, and they were very excited, but the story was 180,000 words. And so they'd heard that this is too long for a debut fantasy, which I would say is quite correct. This is almost double what might be recommended for a debut fantasy. So because of this, they were considering splitting the book into 2. And they said that didn't really feel right to them. And I'm really glad that intuitively they felt the incorrectness of this advice. Usually, authors who have written a book that's too long are just told to split it into 2 books. But this is oversimplifying the process of splitting a book into 2. Generally speaking, I would never recommend splitting a book in half just because it's too long. If your story is too long, there's probably a lot of other things that are happening that need to be addressed before you actually consider making it into 2 different books. Most of the time, splitting a book in half just creates more problems than it actually solves. And there are multiple reasons for this, which we will be touching on today. And the main reason that I don't recommend this is because when you sat down and you started working on your story, you planned for all of this stuff to happen in a single book. And so when you cut it in half, you are essentially just cutting all of the story arcs in half. You don't have anything that is finished or complete about book 1, and everything is resolved in book 2. And that is not a satisfying reading experience for readers. So if you plan to split a book into 2, there is a lot more work that goes into it than just cutting the book in half. So in order for a story to go from a single book into 2 books, you need to have one overarching story arc that starts in book 1 and is not resolved until the end of book 2. And then each book has to have a story arc, a main plot, main story goal that's not resolved until the end of each book. Because if everything's resolved in book 1, readers won't feel compelled to read book 2. And if nothing is resolved until the end of book 2, then at the end of book 1, you leave readers feeling unsatisfied. They feel like they've wasted time because you promised a resolution when you started the story and you introduced the main story goal. You promised a resolution to that. And then by the end of the book, if you don't deliver, you lose reader trust. So the advice of just splitting a book in half when it's too long is oversimplified. There is a lot of restructuring that needs to happen in order for the split of the books to make sense for the reader. And that's really why splitting a book in 2 is not a quick fix for having a story that is too long. But you might be wondering, there has to be some sort of reason why splitting a book in half is the right move, right? And yes, there is a potential for when splitting a book into might make sense for your story. So if the protagonist's main story goal is just so big, so large that it's going to take the protagonist a long time to achieve the goal, then it could be more reasonable to have that goal be overarching in through 2 books, right? And then having a separate goal for the first book and then another separate goal for the second book. And that's just because if you really cannot condense down the protagonist achieving that main story goal, that really big one, then it makes sense for it to span a couple of books. But that being said, many writers feel like things cannot be cut that absolutely can be cut. Okay. So instead of jumping right to, oh, yep, I can't condense my main plot at all, like this, it all has to be here. Wait just a second, because we're going to talk about the real reason your book is most likely too long. Most books aren't too long because the story is just so big that it takes all of that time and that space to tell the story. That's usually not the case. More often than not, it's too long because you feel too close to the story and you feel like everything's important. It could be that you're including a lot of world building detail that's just not really relevant to the story. The reader just doesn't need to know it. And it feels important to you because you've spent all of this time building this really rich, wonderful world, and you want to invite the reader into it. And that's wonderful and beautiful, but you do not need to share anything that is not directly relevant to the story that you're telling. Another common cause for adding unnecessary length to a story is having a character arc for a character who really does not need a character arc. And then lastly, another cause could be subplots that do not further the theme and do not complicate the main plot. And one objection that I hear a lot is that fantasy writers in particular feel like fantasy books are supposed to be really long. And that's because they're probably thinking of stories like Lord of the Rings, these long, epic tales. And yes, fantasy can be long, but we have to remember that in today's market, in today's publishing landscape, you do not want to debut with a book that is over 90,000 words. With fantasy, you might have a little bit of stretch up to 100,000 words, but anything past that, you do not want to publish as a debut. You have to remember, if you want to go traditional and you want to be traditionally published, publishers do not want to publish a book that is that long. You got to think about it from their point of view. You're a debut author, so you're not proven yet, and publishing long books is expensive. They have to charge a lot of money for them because they have to print a lot more pages. And charging a lot of money for a book for an author who is brand new is difficult. So you just need to make sure that you understand that from their perspective, it might not be that your story is bad, but it's just that they aren't sure if they're going to be able to sell enough of them to make it worth it. And so if you are deciding to self-publish your story, you need to take this into consideration as well, because readers may not want to invest their time into a book that is super long from an author that they haven't built any sort of trust or rapport with. So you just need to keep those kinds of things in mind. Ultimately, having a longer book makes it more difficult to sell to both readers and agents. Now, when it comes to story length, it's really easy to feel like you don't want to get rid of anything because you just love all of your ideas so much. And that's totally wonderful. And I just want to encourage you that just because you love an idea does not mean that it has to be included in this particular story. It's okay to take an idea and put it into your great idea vault that you can take from later when you're working on another project where that idea might fit a little bit better with the story that you're telling. Putting them in the idea vault and pulling them out for a different story also allows you to include them in a story that has more space for them, where they can be a bigger part of the story and they can actually get the time in the spotlight that those great ideas deserve. One of the biggest complaints that I hear from writers is that they just don't know what to cut. The entire story, like I mentioned, feels important, and it's difficult to go in and start cutting scenes out. And I get it. A big part of the reason why it feels like this is because you're just really close to your story. You're really proud of it and you're really happy with it, and that's wonderful. But while your story is great, the story as it is right now in the first draft is not as great as it's going to be once you go through all of these revisions. And cutting scenes gets a lot easier when you know what your story is truly about at its core. You should be able to sum up your story in a single sentence. And this makes a lot of writers feel uncomfortable because it feels really difficult. It's actually super simple, okay? The single sentence does not need to sum up absolutely everything that happens in your story. It should really just describe the main plot of the story. And if you can sum it up in a single sentence, you can use that sentence as your North Star for revising your story, and cutting things becomes so much easier because if it's not relevant to that sentence, it's got to go. If you have found yourself with a story that's too long, you might be feeling like you have wasted a bunch of time having written, let's say, 180,000 words, because you're going to have to cut down at least 80,000 of those words, and it feels like a waste of time. But I want to encourage you and let you know that it's not a waste of time. You could have needed to write those 180,000 words to finish the story, to finish telling the story to yourself. And it will ultimately benefit you as a writer because it's great practice. Writing just helps you get better at writing. We all have to practice more in order to get better. So it's not a waste of time at all. It is time that you spent developing your skills as a writer. At the end of the day, I think that a lot of writers entertain the idea of splitting their book into two because splitting the story sounds easier than cutting unnecessary portions out of the story. But I think you ultimately do yourself a disservice when you split the story in two instead of really focusing on cutting out the parts of the story that are not enhancing the main plot. You will end up with a much tighter story at the end than if you were to just cut it in half, sell it as two different books, and call it a day. If you are interested in learning how you should go about cutting down your story, let me know in the comments below. I would really enjoy walking through a real life example of how I think through this when I am editing for clients. And if you would find that helpful, please let me know because I would thoroughly enjoy making a video on that. But I only want to do it if it is something that you would find helpful. Thank you so much for watching. Make sure you give this video a thumbs up if you enjoyed it and subscribe to the channel because I'm making more videos just like this. Thanks again, and I will see you in the next video.